class, and welcome to online lecture number 3, where today we're going to discuss the church in late antiquity. On the table for discussion are 3 different primary source documents that include the Edict of Milan, the Nicene Creed, and excerpts from Augustine's massive City of God. And so in this lecture, I want to build out the historical context that is necessary for us to understand and discuss these 3 documents. And it begins with a discussion of the conversion of Constantine and the beginnings of a, big scare quotes here, Christian Roman Empire. Which leads me to ask a big question. What do we mean when we categorize a government as Christian? Can any government or institution truly be labeled as Christian? And what advantages and disadvantages are to be had when this label is applied? So by 311, Christianity is now a legal religion. However, fast forward to October 312, and there is a dream or a vision that Constantine has that changes Christianity forever. You see, Constantine is at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge with his rival Maxentius. Now, at this time in the Roman Empire, there's 3 different emperors over 3 sections of this massive empire, and they're constantly at war with one another. And before this battle, in the clouds, Constantine sees the Chi-Rho, right? An early Christian symbol, and emblazoned above it, it says, "In this sign, conquer." And so after seeing this in this vision, Constantine commands his troops to place the Chi-Rho on their shields. They go on to win a decisive victory, and Constantine from this moment on claims that this vision converted him to Christianity. Now, we might be tempted to ask the question, well, is Constantine a true Christian, right? Like, is this a genuine conversion, or is this a tool of political unification? I mean, upon Constantine's death, a statue of him was erected to pay homage to his status as a pagan deity. Well, remember, as historians, it is not our role to judge the authenticity of one's faith, but rather to describe, observe, and ask those big questions. So when we get to 313, we see the publication or the proclamation of the Edict of Milan. And in the Edict of Milan, Christianity is given full freedom in the empire. Now, in the history of Christianity, the distinction between religious and political, religious and secular, religious and economic, they're no longer so clearly defined in the Edict of Milan. Because if religion is so tied to the state, then what differentiates between a political or religious decision? What is religion now that is an arm of the state? What are politics now that the church is deeply involved? What are economics? What is literature? How can we begin to separate these categories? Which becomes really difficult after the Edict of Milan in 313. And so what we have happening here in 313 is a drastic move from toleration to the official adoption of Christianity as a state religion. And so following this action, the church starts building large church structures through public funds. And what I mean by public funds is I mean taxes, right? So the church in a moment becomes a taxpayer-funded institution and arm of the state. And in this moment, former pagans flood into the church to convert to Christianity. Now in 324, Constantine becomes sole emperor. And when he becomes the sole emperor, Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea to sort out what is known as the Arian controversy, right? When the Arians are making the claim that Christ is not consubstantial. Christ is not co-eternal with God. Christ is not co-equal. And in the process of this, Constantine moves the imperial capital from Rome to Constantinople. which is modern day Istanbul, Turkey, right? And he does this in 330. And so this move sets the imperial capital at an intersection between major trade routes in the west and in the east, also known as the Silk Road. So Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea in 324, and it is to be held in this new capital, right? Or near the new capital in Constantinople. Now, this is the first ecumenical or first worldwide church council where 318 bishops are present. Now, there's a number of reasons for calling the council. First, there's major political reasons. So after defeating his rivals, Constantine desired political unity in the empire through a commonly held religion. So clearly, Constantine has political motivations in unifying the empire through religion. So that's the first reason why this Council of Nicaea is called political. The second reason is indeed theological, especially as it relates to the Arian controversy. Now, Arius in his teachings claimed that the Father is God, the Son and the Spirit, while God in name, are not truly or fully divine or co-equal with God. Now, Arius, he was a presbyter in Alexandria. He upsets Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, and he believed in the complete unchangeability and unity of God, not a Trinitarian. And so he spreads this idea that there was a time when the Son was not. And he spreads this through Egypt and parts of Syria and Asia Minor, and it becomes rather popular in the church. Now, in response, Athanasius leads this campaign, if you will, and begins to create the boundaries of orthodoxy. So Athanasius makes the claim, hey, Arius, your ideas make no sense because one, people have, and this is Athanasius' claim, people have always worshipped Jesus as God. And secondly, if Jesus is a creature, if Jesus is created, then he cannot save creation, right? And so this orthodox position emerges at the Council of Nicaea through Athanasius. God the Son has eternally existed with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. He is of the same substance as the Father. He entered into human history as a man when he was conceived and born as Jesus of Nazareth. So, Jesus is fully God and fully man. And so there's some implications then that emerge from that, right? Jesus worshiped as God, and Jesus not being created, but eternal, then creatures cannot save other creatures from sin. Now, I want to encourage you to look for Athanasius's clear refutation of Arius within the Nicene Creed. So ultimately ask, where am I seeing an affirmation of Jesus' identity as fully God, fully man, co-equal and co-eternal with God the Father? One thing I also love about the Council of Nicaea, St. Nicholas, St. Nicholas is like Santa Claus. I mean, not Santa Claus, but I like to think of it as Santa Claus. St. Nicholas becomes so fed up with Arius that he steps out on the debate floor and punches Arius in the face. So long before we knew St. Nicholas as one jolly old St. Nick who gave Christmas gifts to little children, he's punching heretics in the face. And so here's some of the results of the council. So the Arians, and there's a contingent of Arians that are gathered in this council. The Arians lose to a vote of 316 to 2, right? So the votes of 316 bishops against Arius to 2 bishops in favor of Arius. And one thing that's fascinating is Arius actually signed the agreement that affirmed Jesus's consubstantiality. But Arius was still banished along with the two dissenting voters. And so that's one thing we have to recognize, is that at the end of the council, Arius signs the agreement that says his belief was outside of this newly defined orthodoxy, and yet still he is banished. As a result of this council, the council granted political power to religious hierarchies, and then it created political tensions as well. Because remember, now the church and the state are intimately intertwined with one another. So bishops in cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome, bishops known to have Arian tendencies, they positioned themselves versus the authorities in Constantinople, right? And so the first three cities with their metropolitan bishops started to resent ecclesiastical and political influence of this upstart capital, Constantinople. So we see emerging after the Council of Nicaea a rivalry happening not only between state officials, but church officials in Rome and Constantinople. And this is largely due to the fact that the once small movement, persecuted, separated from the state, was now under the direct authority of the state. And so in part of this reaction, the church really forms a response to this new alliance of church and state. And first and foremost, there emerges an appreciation, even an adulation for Constantine, right? And of course, that leads me to another question, right? Like, we in America, we tend to see the intertwining of church and state as unappealing. We value the separation of church and state. But my question is, for these early Christians here in the 3rd, the 4th century, why would Christians be glad for this new agreement? Right? Like Eusebius of Caesarea, he's particularly just overjoyed at this new agreement. And how then did this change Christianity? Did it change it for better? Did it change it for worse? And then also, in another response to this new relationship between church and state, this is the moment following 325 where we see a rise in monasticism. So this monastic movement emerges out of this church-state relationship. So to some, the church, the ecclesia, was no longer pure. It had become tainted by the political and even pagan motivations of the state, right? So some of the early monks or monastic movement leaders would be Anthony of Thebes, right? He believed that in order to reject this new relationship between church and state, that true followers, and that's super important, right? He begins to, again, mark boundaries of authenticity, true tests of faith, authenticity of real and pure religious Christian expression. But Anthony of Thebes said that real and true Christian needed to find a solitary and ascetic lifestyle, right? Others went into the desert to be alone like him. Pachamius, he was relatively ascetic, but formed the first monasteries and convents. But in this time, monks became these new heroes of faith, since the state was no longer killing Christians, which is a reason why some would have celebrated this new church-state relationship, because Christians were no longer persecuted. Now, these monks living this ascetic, solitary, impoverished lifestyle, in some ways, this had a detrimental effect on the state of individual faith within the church, right? The state-favored church brought in a number of individuals who ascribed to Christianity not because of a personal experience that drew them to Christ, but for purely political motivations and purely political positioning. Thus, the monks, in order to sustain and protect true Christianity, they retreated. However, it made monks into these new super Christians, right? When all they were doing was what Christians had been doing for the last 300 years. But now, without the threat of being eaten by a Roman lion, right? Without the threat of being eaten by a Roman lion, now they kind of elevated their status. And Martin Luther and the other reformers would come to figure this out in the 16th century. And that leads us then to a discussion of Augustine of Hippo and his far-reaching influence. And I want to begin our discussion of Augustine by presenting you with your discussion question to be included in this week's weekly response. So Augustine, in his writing, The City of God, that you're reading for this week, Augustine addresses the rise of Emperor Constantine. He addresses the fall of Rome and the nature of Christianity in the state. So inhabiting these two worlds in the context of the City of God. So here's the question. How does he reconcile the existence of evil and the collapse of earthly powers with the idea of a benevolent and all-powerful God? In other words, for Augustine, how does he reconcile good and evil and the rise and fall of nations within the context of his Christian belief? How does he reconcile good and evil, the rise and fall of nations and political leaders in the context of his emerging Christian belief, theology, and practice? Well, to help you answer that, I want to give a little background on Augustine. So Augustine recorded in his Confessions, written between 397 and 398, he acknowledged, this is often acknowledged as the first autobiography of Western civilization. And in this Confessions, Augustine confesses his sins. He describes in vivid detail his sexual exploits and then calls upon God to give him salvation. I want to just offer a quick story. I once had a student who wrote a paper on Augustine's confession, and these are undergrads, by the way, and his primary source was not Augustine's Confessions, but the R&B artist Usher's confession. Yeah, like song lyrics. I'm not making it up. So anyway, a little bit about Augustine's childhood. He's born in Roman North Africa, which is now Algeria, to parents Patricius and Monica. Patricius was a pagan and Monica was a Christian. Monica would ceaselessly pray for him, continually calling upon God to help him become a Christian. Augustine goes to school at Carthage to study rhetoric, and while in Carthage, he becomes a really big fan of the city life. He frequented the brothels, engaging in a number of sexual exploits, keeping a regular concubine with him, who bore him a son. And at 19 years old, he reads Cicero, which inspires him to begin this new quest to find capital T truth. And in 373, he starts this 11-year interest in Manichaeanism. Now, we've talked about Manichaeanism before, but Manichaeanism is akin to Gnosticism. It started in the Persian Empire in the 3rd century, and it taught that there was this primeval conflict between light and darkness. Manichaeanism would go on to confirm that Jesus, Buddha, their leader Mani, were teachers sent to release, through their teachings, the light that was trapped in people's bodies by Satan. So later then, Augustine moves to Rome in 383 to make more money as a rhetoric teacher. His students don't pay him in Rome, and so he moves to Milan. While he's in Milan, he meets St. Ambrose of Milan. He's incredibly impressed with Ambrose's speaking ability and the Christian gospel being taught, this is important, in what he estimated was an intelligent manner, one informed by the great truths of philosophy. So Ambrose was one that was using Greek philosophy as a bridge to proclaim the gospel. And so we read in Augustine's Confessions that he underwent this conversion experience, right? He converts to Christianity, and in his personal experiences, as expressed in Confessions, we recognize that His personal experiences directly shape his view on sin, grace, God, humankind, and sex. And his thought forever impacts the formation of Christian theology. The first way that it impacts Christian theology is through his thinking on the nature of the church, specifically his response to the Donatist controversy. So a little bit of background on this controversy. There were some bishops who lapsed under imperial persecution that came before the Edict of Toleration between 303 and 311. Right? Bishops, in the midst of persecution, they gave over their scriptures to be burned and renounced their faith. And so Donatus, who was a bishop of Carthage, argued that these lapsed leaders who caved to persecution should no longer be permitted to minister to others, right? And he said whatever ministry that the apostates, bishops who denied Christ in the midst of persecution, whatever ministry they did, including ordination, administering the sacraments, all of that was invalid. And so Donatus wanted a pure church of unlapsed, hardcore, committed leaders and members. Well, Augustine provides a response to this, as even by Augustine's time, Donatism was still very much alive. Right? So Augustine, he rejects this idea that such thing as a pure church even exists. Right? And I think this reflects his doctrine of sin. Augustine favored a mixed body. Right? A mixed body of both good and bad people within the visible church, right? So relying on Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30 as his justification, Augustine claimed that the field was the church, right? And the commingled wheat were Christians and the tares were lost people. And he claimed that they couldn't be separated until judgment. However, Jesus interprets the parable in the same chapter, stating that, hey, the field is the world, right? Well, not only does Augustine reject the idea of a pure church, but he also makes the claim that, hey, sacraments worked, right? They remained means of grace, blessed by God. They worked in the lives of believers despite the failings of those who offered the sacraments, right? And then finally, in response to Donatism, he believed that Donatists should be compelled to re-enter the church, re-enter the one church by state power, right? And this relied on the assumption of the early church that the church should be one holy, apostolic, universal church. So Augustine's thought helped change the shape of the church in his response to Donatism. He also provided response to another controversy known as the Pelagian controversy. So Pelagius was a monk from England, and he comes to Rome around the year 400 and is shocked by the lack of morality displayed by Christians. And so Pelagius's disciple, Coelestius, he wanted to be bishop of Carthage, but Augustine said no. And so Pelagius believed that human beings are born neither righteous nor wicked, so a type of blank slate, but can choose to live either way, right? And he even said that Adam is a bad moral example, but in no way is he responsible for the sins of humanity, right? So Pelagius believed that God commands people to be holy, so it's possible then to live a sinless life without divine aid. And so Augustine provides a response to Pelagius. He says, no. Human beings are born into sin because they inherit guilt from the first Adam, right? Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sin, right? Augustine believed that the first act of disobedience is original sin, a condition all possess and will ultimately lead to the committing of personal sin. And so for Augustine, people are not sinners because they sin. They sin because they are first sinful people possessing a distorted nature. Also, strong desire, and especially sexual desire for Augustine, is a result of original sin. And so Augustine's uneasiness about sex is clear here. And a large reason why many Christian discourses categorize sex as something inherently sinful or dirty, it's because of Augustine's long-standing impact. So for Augustine, original sin was turning away from God, the life source, and unto death. Thus, humanity possesses an innate desire to recover that life, which is later picked up in the Middle Ages, the medieval period even, by Thomas Aquinas. So to continue, and then we'll wrap this up, Augustine also believed that human beings cannot live righteously by their own effort because they are in bondage to sin. He believed that sin affects every aspect of humanity: emotions, will, intellect, relationship. It stains and distorts human nature. Additionally, Augustine believed that in order to overcome human sin, God offered Jesus as atonement for sin and offered salvation. So within Augustine's theology, God specifically, and this is important because we'll see this develop throughout the history of the church, God specifically chooses those who receive this offer of salvation. Boethius would later write to address the problems with Augustine's inconsistent predestination. But using Augustine's thought as a baseline against Pelagianism, Pelagianism is condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431. And Augustine's view on sin and grace played a huge role later on in the Protestant debates with Roman Catholics on the nature of salvation in the 16th century, and later on in the 18th century Methodist revivals in England. And so today we won't get to much of Augustine's theology, like on the atonement and predestination, though that should work into your answer on how Augustine understands the rise and fall of nations or the appointment of political leaders, like especially considering Augustine's hardline view of predestination. But real quick, as we wrap up, I want to provide just a brief note on the City of God. Augustine's City of God, which is written between 412 and 427, it provides I think in many ways for the first time, a Christian view of history, right? So Augustine reflects on Alaric's sack of Rome and the aftermath. People flee from North Africa, and the pagans blame who? They blame the Christians. And Christians ask God, why did you allow Rome to be sacked? And that's the baseline question for the City of God, right? And the City of God is in response, it's a theodicy in many ways, a response to why God would allow the pagans to destroy Rome. And so for Augustine, all of humanity is represented by two cities, right? One, the worldly city. Rome is just like any other city, temporal, full of godless behavior, corruption, oppression, on and on. And then there's the heavenly city. So there's this kind of dualistic thinking here. And this heavenly city is understood in like the terms and the imagery of the New Jerusalem, this real, eternal city filled with the godly. And Augustine says at one point, the heavenly city outshines Rome beyond comparison. There, instead of victory is truth. Instead of high rank, there's holiness. Instead of peace, love, and faith, instead of life, there is eternity. Right? So Augustine made this claim, hey, be in the world, but not of the world, because you are a citizen of God's city. Augustine dies in August of 430, and he leaves a tremendous legacy. He laid out a Christian philosophy of history that influenced medieval Christians to be much more concerned with the heavenly city than the worldly city. And I would leave you with this question: how did Augustine's emphasis on the heavenly city impact Christians' involvement in the worldly city, right? Or think about the societal issues that Christians might face throughout their history. I think Augustine has a deep impact there. Well, I'm looking forward to discussing this material with you. Thanks for listening, watching, and I'll see you soon.